Hey, you guys, happy Monday. If you will be turning in your Bibles to John chapter 8, we're going to be in verses 2 through 11. Just want to wish everybody a happy coming back from spring break, all the teachers and students and parents that I have in my audience. I pray that last week was a week of refreshing for you, and as you go through this week, transitioning back kind of into your normal schedules, I hope that everything goes incredibly smoothly for you. Thank you for the support and for watching my videos and keeping me in your thoughts and prayers. So we're going to be starting in verse 2 in John chapter 8, and that starts and says, "At dawn he," again he being Jesus, "went to the temple again, and he saw the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began to teach to them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, making her stand in the center. 'Teacher,' they said, 'this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery, and Moses' law commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say to this?' They asked him this so they might trap him, so they might have evidence to accuse him. Jesus stooped down and started writing on the ground with his finger. When they persisted in questioning him, he stood up and said to them, 'The one without sin should be the one to throw the first stone at her.' He then stooped down and continued writing on the ground. When they heard this, they left one by one with the older men, and only he was left with the woman in the center. When Jesus stood up, he said to her, 'Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?' 'No one, Lord,' she answered. He said, 'Neither do I condemn you. Go now and sin no more.'" So when you look at this is really an interesting perspective, number one, for the Pharisees and the scribes and the teachers trying to catch Jesus in kind of this weird catch-22, but also for the way that Jesus handles this woman's sin. So the first point I want to make today, when it's talking about trapping him, what was their plan here? So their first attempt was, if they can catch him and he's agreeing with Moses' law that they need to commit murder on this woman who committed adultery, then they can go before the Caesar and they can say, "Look, this guy is saying that we need to kill people in public, we need to have him arrested." So that's the first thing that they're trying to do. And if he says that they need to not kill this woman, then he can go to the Jewish people and he can go to the people that he's been teaching to, and they can undercut his entire message. They could say, "Look, he doesn't even believe in the law. Look what he says here. He didn't say put this woman to death," which Moses agreed with. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to get him in this weird catch-22. And when you look at James 2:10, it says if you fall in one point of the law, you're guilty in all. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to catch Jesus, and they're trying to get him in this weird catch-22 where if he answers one way, they can go and have him arrested, and if he answers the other way, they can go and they can have his message undercut to the people. And the way that Jesus responds and the way that Jesus answers is so powerful because he turns the tables on them and he says, "Look, if you want to put this woman to death, put this woman to death, but he who is without sin cast the first stone." And what's so important about that is when you look, later in the New Testament in Romans, it talks about how all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. You look at the law in the Old Testament, it was a system that nobody could live up to. That's why we needed Jesus in the first place, to come and to die for us and to be our final sacrifice, was because it was a system that was so highly regarded, and you were held your feet to the fire 100% on everything that you would ever do. And it was to the point where nobody could live a perfect life. So that's why we had to have Jesus come and abolish the law and to fulfill the law and to become the promise of that law and to become our final sacrifice. So he turns it around and he's saying, "Look, if you agree with Moses so much, go ahead and put this woman to death, but the one who is without sin, cast the first stone. The one who's never done anything wrong, go ahead and throw the first stone." And you see how that actually works out. People walk away until it's just Jesus and this woman left, and he's saying, "Is no one left to condemn you?" And she says, "No, Lord." And that brings me to my second point. As Christians, we're not supposed to judge people, and we're not supposed to cherry pick who we love and who we don't love. And we're not supposed to act as judge, jury, and executioner. When you look at what Jesus says, and he says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." And that's really kind of a big deal because it's really funny when you think about it. Like, it's really easy to look at other people's sin and say, "Man, they got some figuring it out to do with God. They got to get, on the right track, and look at what they're doing. It's so heavy and that burden's weighing them down so much." And then we look at our sin and we're like, "It's not that big of a deal." Well, when you look at the Bible, it talks about all sin being weighed equally, and it talks about everyone who commits one sin. Look back at James, we just talked about it. If you fall down in one point, you're guilty of the whole law. And when you look at it from that perspective, we don't get to look at somebody else's sin and say, oh, they're in such a worse place than I am. So all I've got to do is pray a couple prayers and get right. They got to change their whole life. No, that's not a luxury we have. You look at Romans 5:8, and it talks about when we're still sinners, Christ died for us. And that carries so much weight because it's saying that Jesus came and bled and died. As we talked about last week, he's been since the beginning of time, and he saw everything we ever did wrong, everything everyone ever did wrong, and he came and he died for us anyway because he loved us that much. Matthew 5:43 talks about loving and praying for your enemies. As Christians, we don't get to judge people, and we don't get to cherry pick who we love, because Jesus is flat out saying right here, you have to love and you have to pray for your enemies, and you have to treat them as you treat yourself. And then you look at Acts chapter 10, and it's talking about who is right in the sight of in the sight of God. It's all the people that love and fear him. And what that's referring to is referring to all the nations. So in this time in history, the Gentiles were included into God's love and God's promise. And he alluded to that by saying they're like a branch that you take off one tree and graft into another, and it grows as one tree. That tree being God's love and God's promise and God's family. And now all of a sudden it's extended to everyone. And the problem that the Pharisees and the Scribes were running into here is they liked when they were a part of that, but they didn't really like when other people were a part of it, or at least they used that to get on to Jesus. And what's happening here is Jesus is turning it around, and he's saying, look, if you want to judge somebody, that's fine, but get ready, because you're going to be judged in the same manner. When you look at it, it says he who is without sin cast the first stone. So Jesus is basically saying, like, look, if you think you're up for it, you go ahead and throw that first stone. So I think that's a really important message to Christians today, is you don't get to judge somebody because they sin differently than you. That's a quote. I've tried to look for the source. I cannot find it, but I've heard it a million times. Please don't attribute it to me because it wasn't my idea. But that's really powerful, is you don't get to judge somebody because they sin differently than you. And the third thing, I think this is the thing that kind of gets left out of this message the most. It's Jesus says, okay, to this woman, he says, no one's here to condemn you. That's fine. Go and sin no more. I think as Christians and as people and as flawed people, we like to take that stop and we like the no judgment part, right? And that's great. Jesus recognizes that we sin. He recognizes that we're going to fall short. He came and died for us anyway so that we have forgiveness, we have everlasting life, we have mercy. But what's the caveat to that? Go and sin no more. Paul later on talks about, he says, should I keep sinning because God's grace is there for me and God's grace is powerful? And he says, God forbid, which is meaning, like, how could I even have a thought like that? How can you even have a thought like that? So the idea is we don't get caught up in judgment, and people ideally should not be judging us, and we're going to get caught up in sin every now and then. But the idea from there is we don't just get to live there. We have to go and we have to sin no more. So as a challenge this week, guys, reaching out and offering a challenge at the end of this devotional, whenever you do fall short and whenever you do sin this week, look at it from the perspective of Jesus talking to this woman, and look at it as you being caught and you leaving it there at the altar and you moving on with your life. And on the flip side of the coin, when somebody else does something to wrong you, look at it from the perspective that Jesus looked at it from, and look at it how he told the Pharisees to look at it. He says, judge if you want, but only judge if you're perfect. And that carries a lot of weight, guys, especially in today's society. So as you go throughout this week, just think and meditate on that. And I'll see you next week. Bye.